the most important things to understand is the probability field. Now, a probability field is created by any given set of variables. Take the United States, where there's a 33% chance that a domestic relationship will include some form of domestic violence, or that 1 in 7 people will have a substance addiction, or that the majority of people will be compulsive, meaning addicted to a form of behavior correlated with unresolved trauma. These probability fields are generated by the combination of the physical literal environment. An interesting aside is that northern countries and environments that include harsh winters tend to be more masculine, meaning the lineal strategic mind, that is the more masculine mind, the get to the point, the stay focused, the stay disciplined mind, as opposed to the more spontaneous, the more present, the more emotion-based feminine mind. The disciplined mind is a natural byproduct of the trauma of winter. Trauma, which stimulates the reptilian brain in its fight, flight, freeze mechanism that dissociates from emotion in order to focus on getting the job done, is a necessary strength in order to survive a harsh winter. Because nobody feels spontaneously like cutting wood in July, going to the beach, sunbathing is a lot more interesting. And yet it is the trauma of harsh experience in a northern country that creates the discipline that leads not only to chopping the wood, making the wood pile, buying a stove when you don't need it, preparing, if you're very intelligent, buying the winter clothes in the summer when they're on sale. That long-term thinking, stepping out of the moment and into the future, is environmentally based. Now, when you go to a country like Thailand, it is a very feminine country. It is a very emotional, very spontaneous, very present country. Because in a temperate, warm country, where it's warm year-round, where you are surrounded by fish, where you are surrounded by tropical fruits on all sides, there is no incentive to dissociate from the present, to focus on something that is never showing up. You have tsunamis from time to time. You can't really prepare for them. They don't come at a predictable schedule. They may not do any harm. And so environment is an aspect of a variable, because in colder countries you have more trauma, you have more potential for trauma, so you have more masculine traits. Now, the overdevelopment of the left lineal brain, as correlated in the university professors and individuals that have the highest number of degrees, this is not correlating with happiness and well-being. It correlates with a certain amount of stature, which correlates to well-being. But as a noun, meaning if you take it out of social context in a culture that idolizes the left lineal brain, it does not bring happiness. And this is very logical. The happiest person who's focused on happiness is not going to get off the beach, get on a work suit in the middle of July, start a smelly chainsaw, go out in the woods and cut down wood and carefully measure them so they'll fit into a certain fireplace, etc., and haul that wood to the house and then split it and say, wow, this is the best use of my time. The left lineal brain is a fear and future-based brain that is stimulated initially by weather-based trauma being anything that has the actual threat to human life or the perceived threat to human life. That now we're in the domain of trauma. And it is a deep biological circuit, and it is satisfying, certainly. It calms down the adrenals that get revved up with the awareness that, oh my God, I may freeze to death because I don't have a log cabin, because I don't have wood for it, because I go to get snowed in. Something growing up in upstate New York, you learn very quickly that you get a snowstorm, and even with a car, even with electricity, etc., you can be snowed in for days. It can get too cold unless you have enough wood for the wood fire and all of that. So a probability field is created by the natural environment, but it is also created by culture. Because culture, the policies of a government, the belief systems and value hierarchies of a culture also correlate with the amount of trauma, with the amount of pain, with the amount of ascension through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have survival, you have security in that survival, and you have love and belonging, the first core needs. And in a very individualistic culture, the United States is more focused on the individual than almost any culture or country in history. If you don't get the wood for your fire or the money for your retirement, you fail. And if you fail, you die. And this awareness in a complex matrix where literally the mind can be present to 100,000 things that can go wrong. Someone could steal my wood. The tarp could break and it could get all wet. The matches could go missing. My son could burn the house down. There are so many things that could go wrong that are out of the individual control. But if you're in a culture, that is collective in nature, for example, a socialist democracy of the nature that they have in Denmark, and an interesting corollary with the Scandinavian countries, more billionaires per capita at 80% taxes in a socialist democracy. Now, what does socialist democracy mean? In very practical terms, it means that every Danish adult got paid to go to an exceptional college. It's about $1,000 a month. They get an allowance for going to college. You don't have to. It's just you make money to go to a great college. Get free health care. Your housing needs are provided for. If you don't like your job in Denmark, you give notice. You don't lose benefits, etc. You give notice. You stop doing your job. What, do you sit around being bored? No. If you're Danish, you think about something you're passionate about. And do you have to go homeless or without food to fund that training? No. Your government provides you with exceptional training for a job that you're passionate about, so that within a year, you're back employed doing something you really love. That's why I didn't meet any Danish people who were unemployed. I didn't meet any Danish people who didn't have a college education. I didn't meet any Danish people that hated their government. I didn't meet any Danish people that hated their country. I met happy, well-educated, gainfully employed Danish people in a socialist democracy with a higher quality of life by a factor of 300% than the average American. Now, if we step out of dogma and look at the probability field, now this is quite remarkable. I remember walking through the gorgeous parks in Copenhagen and taking a train ride on the high-speed train, and I'd interview someone in the park and interview someone on the bus and interview someone in the restaurants and interview someone on the street. I interviewed 30 Danish people, and 30 for 30 loved their government, loved their, and they had no fear. I tried to figure out what was going on there that was so remarkable. They had no fear. Because in a socialist democracy, if a 1 in 1,000 event happens to you, which is what most emergencies are, they're 1 in 1,000. If a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 event occurs to you, the community, the government, the country, your friends will respond. One of the interesting things in the United States is that there is a very high probability that within a 10-year period, an individual is going to go through a financial or health crisis. Maybe they get a divorce. Maybe a partner embezzled their money. Maybe they have an accident, an auto accident, and then they get laid off because they can't go back to work, and then they can't pay their medical bills. And then they go into debt, and then they declare bankruptcy. So there is a very high probability within a 10-year period that an American is going to go through a major crisis. Now, in a highly individual culture that makes these cultures, see, it's the culture and the environment that generate these statistics. You see, if you're born in Denmark, or if you go and live in Denmark, or go and live in Thailand or something, the statistics suddenly change. It's not the individual that creates the statistic. Now, the individual has to bet against the house. So if you've got a stack of 100 statistics with a 99.99% chance of losing in at least one of those games where the deck is stacked against you, where you're betting against Vegas, and this is a statistical probability field. If you go to Vegas as the average person and place 100 bets in Vegas, there is at least a 60% chance that you will lose a lot more than you make. At least a 60% chance that you will lose a lot more than you make. Now, if you do that 1,000 times, the odds of you coming out ahead in Vegas are very, very, very low statistically. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be a genius, that you can't count cards, that you can't figure out this and that and the other and beat the odds. It doesn't mean that there has never been someone who beats the odds. But the odds are created by the house. They are not created by the individual. The odds of an American getting drunk or going to jail or getting a criminal record or participating in spousal violence or being part of sexual abuse, either giving or receiving, in an awareness that both positions are equally toxic. We obviously feel great empathy for the victim, but sexual abuse doesn't come out of nowhere, meaning the perpetrators of sexual abuse are carrying the virus of shame facilitated by the perpetration of sexual abuse and transmitted by the perpetuation of that sexual abuse, which means they've got the virus even deeper than the victim. Whether or not they are numb to it because it's happened so chronically or it expressed itself in a different, and we're such a dissociative culture, both people involved in sexual abuse, in violence, are a party to the disease of that sexual abuse and of that violence. It doesn't mean they're equally responsible. It means that both people are suffering from the symptoms of that disease. The contagious disease, as all trauma that is untended, as all abuse that is unhealed, as all pain that goes unresponded to, transmits, becomes viral in nature. Gary Slutkin does amazing research as an epidemiologist on the contagious nature of violence, meaning much like any other contagion, the flu or anything else, the best way to predict when the next outbreak of violence will be is just after the violence that happened before. And the best place and way to predict the location of the violence is right next to where the last violence took place. It is a contagious disease, much like a fire spreading. And it needs to be treated medically as a contagious disease, as opposed to amplified, meaning moral condemnation, a certain form of violence, is like pouring gas on the flames. When you treat it like a virus and create a viral wall around the violence and bring in water, it puts out the fire. But a probability field is not only created by the physical environment and by the culture, but every child who grows up in a culture internalizes the mythologies, the imbalances, the biases, the beliefs, the thoughts, the memes, the mental, emotional, and physical memes of the culture. So you have a whole group of Americans that don't feel they're at a ball game unless they eat a hot dog composed of mixed animal entrails and this and that and the other, with some white bread and mustard and mayonnaise, and it's not organic, and have a beer and some potato chips, and then they know they're at a ball game, because that's what we do in this culture in a ball game. And you can talk like this and you can behave like this at a ball game. It's a meme. It is a cultural recipe where, in order to belong, which is meeting one of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in order to belong, you must conform to the culture's meme. Now, given the fact that every single human being in the history of humankind has a need, like every other human being, for love and belonging, this is how the culture dictates the probability field. Because if you want to belong, and all your buddies who also want to belong are having a couple of beers and gesturing like this and shouting like this and eating like this and eating another one, and that's great, and everyone's fat, and then to love and be belong, to participate, you have your script. Now this creates a probability field. Now, every probability field generates a certain amount of benefit, or it wouldn't exist. I mean, you don't have, hundreds of millions of people all drinking cyanide by the bottle. It's not usually that covert. The shadow or the pain side of a probability field always exists. It's often hidden, as in the tobacco industry's epic battle to prove that cigarettes don't cause cancer and don't kill people. To what? Protect the cultural norm of taking some plant, drying it, chopping it up into bits, lighting it on fire and sticking it in your mouth and inhaling foul smoke. Why? In order to look cool, a cultural meme. It's kind of interesting. If a culture can pull that off, then why not grind up pepper and stick it up your nose and then anyway, you can create any kind of a meme you want as long as you put it with with enough cachet that people think it's worth doing, and particularly if you can get high prestige people to participate it in some way with the meme. The need for love and belonging will dictate that the people who want to look like and be thought of as like the weird bowler hats or the top hats. Who on earth would invent an uncomfortable hat that's expensive, that bangs, is a top hat, so it's quite high, and you bang your hat on the door, and then you have to find a place to put your hat, and if it gets any mud, and it's black, and it can get mud. Who on earth would invent? I mean, who knows where these things come from? But what will precipitate this meme spreading is if certain rich and noteworthy people that are deemed popular do some bizarre thing, then other people will follow, not on the basis that it is intelligent, but on the basis that they're trying to meet their need for love and belonging in a hierarchy of needs that are shared by all. When you can't even get a job without wearing a bizarre outfit, like a wool suit in South Africa or some bizarre scenario, it's all the Westerners in the 5-star hotel managers. They're usually Westerners in Thailand. They wear full business suits, and they are miserable in them, but that's their job. So who on earth is going to do that unless if you don't get a job, or you get so much more money and respect and prestige only if you wear this bizarre outfit that makes you miserable, except you're being paid to be miserable. So you have a probability field, and it generates a certain amount of pain and a certain amount of well-being. And the big question is, who's going to carry the pain and who's going to get the well-being? Because the probability field is created by all. The culture is, a good 80% of it. The weather and environment is, a good 10, 15% of it. And then you have the variations in personalities and things within a given group of people. Culture includes religions. All of the religions these days are highly chauvinistic, and only men can have power, and that's kind of across the religious board, including the Buddhists. And so, that's part of the culture. So you have chauvinism in the religious areas of culture. It's not so present in the business areas of culture in some countries, more so in others. But the pain that comes from imbalance, when you take a totally whole and wholesome sphere and you start squashing it in the middle and extending it like a more watermelon shape, so that even though it doesn't make any sense, all men are doing this, or even though it doesn't make any sense, women have to wear these incredibly uncomfortable shoes. In a chauvinistic paradigm, height is a symbol of dominance, which is higher on the hierarchy scale in a sociopathic culture. In a sociopathic culture, you want to have more power because then you dominate other people. In an empathic culture, if you have more power, you have more responsibility, you see. If you're in a culture that's premise is that no one goes without their basic needs being met, then the people who have the most strength and the most money and the most brawn and the most height will be using that height to do more work than average that ensures that the most vulnerable, that the youngest, that the elderly, etc., have their needs met. And so suddenly height isn't a status symbol anymore. But it has to be an empathic culture, and we just don't have that on the planet. And so height is a status symbol. The message being that, in a sociopathic culture, you're going to be in battle with other human beings, and the tallest person is going to win, and I want to be with one of the winners. And so you have your mate seeking tall men. It's great in a sociopathic culture. But what's not being analyzed is whether it's great for anyone to perpetuate and be in a sociopathic culture in which the most powerful people will dominate the rest, will dominate the majority, as opposed to an empathic culture where people will work together to bring the greatest attention anywhere on the planet and anywhere in the country to the highest areas of pain. So that if women are once a month going through a painful time of month, that actual research and medical treatment is developed for the menstrual cycle at the same level of seriousness as, if a man is dealing with, with some issue that gets tons of medical attention. When you're in an empathic culture, the big question is, where is the pain? What is the cause of that pain? And what can we do together to reduce that pain? Where is the possibility and the probability of well-being and joy for this population? What would bring more joy, more well-being, more health and vitality? Of all the different ways we could allocate time, money, energy, resources, and R&D. And let's invest in that. Let's take the most unhappy people and the most unhappy areas of our landscape and bring them up. And it is the responsibility, the ability and willingness to respond in an empathic culture of the people who have the most, to contribute the most towards the people who have the least. Not by government mandate or some inefficient communist type thing, but out of empathy. You see, because human beings that feel and understand what another human being feels do this out of empathy, not out of legal mandate and taxation. It's as simple in an empathic culture as saying, you're in pain. That makes me sad. I don't want to be sad. And the best thing that I can do is to help you to put a smile on your face. In an empathic culture, when you see a smile, it makes me happy. I feel happy to see you smile. And in an empathic culture, as opposed to a sociopathic culture, we don't draw arbitrary lines and say, well, your skin is this color and your gender is this and you don't have a penis and all this, and therefore I'm going to treat you as if you're better or worse than this. In an empathic culture, there is an understanding that it is the human condition and the human nature to ascend in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to first try and survive, then to feel secure in that survival, then seek love and belonging in a hierarchy of needs. And if you're stealing and doing this and addicted and all that, you haven't met your need to survive and feel secure in that. You haven't met that need. And because you haven't met that need, you haven't yet advanced to this point where you're seeking love and belonging. You're not in an empathic place yet. And so it's our responsibility, if we want empathic human beings seeking love and belonging, to actually help every individual reach above survival into security in that survival. Security in a place to sleep. Security in healthy soup and bread, and a chance to belong. Security. And then we move into self-esteem and developing gifts. And it's in step 5, after the community helps the individual to survive, feel love and belonging, feel secure in that survival, feel self-esteem. Then the individual develops, on the foundation of that support, their gifts. And it is those individuals that give the most back. What's important to understand is that it is the environment that generates the probability field, that is the statistical certainty of what will happen within the demographics, within that country, within that group, within that gender, etc. In a healthy environment, the focus is not on the individual. The focus is on changing the variables within the culture, within the environment, to make it easier to ascend in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and to improve the probability field. Because if you can get the probability field to where, when you interview 100 people in your group, they're all happy, they're all safe, they're all college educated, whatever it is that you see as the good stuff. If you can create a probability field in which 95, 98% of people are all doing whatever is called good in your paradigm, then you can look at, well, why is, if it's, you might hold a candle to an individual and say, you've got a 98% chance of winning here. Why are you losing repeatedly? How is it that you're going to a betting house where 98 times out of 100, the average person comes out with more money than they gambled, and you're always coming out with less? There's obviously something to be, to pay attention to on the individual level as opposed to the house level. But until you're at a point where, 95, 98% of people are coming out better as a result of participating in that probability field, the focus should not be on the person, but on the variables that create that probability field. And secondly, in a healthy culture, that creates a toxic probability field. And what's coming to mind here is the pain and the well-being is evenly distributed. In other words, if I want to stay in a strong social bond with a group of 5 people, and we're in a game, in a probability field, in an environment where every single day, one person of the 5 is going to go without food. Let's say we're in a sales environment. And on any given day, one person comes back without a sale, and they don't eat. If we want to maintain a strong social bond, a healthy dynamic in that probability field where every day 1 in 5 doesn't eat, doesn't make the sale, this has to be smoothed out. This volatility of sale, 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 nothing has to be smoothed out by creating a new probability field. Now, that's where savings and investments can come in for the time that, that's one way of working with it. Another way is sharing, to hedge the risk, to say, look, we have a risk here. One in every day. There's 1 in 5 of us that doesn't eat. Now, this can be created by the fact that there's only 4 customers and there's 5 salespeople. When the 2009 housing crisis hit the United States real estate markets, 50% of the home improvement industry dissolved, meaning there were 50% less customers overnight. But the businesses were still there. Now, this means either that all the businesses will make less, but more accurately, what it means is that some businesses just go out of business, and that other businesses almost go out of business and go into incredible hardship. And then there's some that are buffered in some way. Maybe they work for very wealthy people who frankly don't stop their gardening or whatever work, whether they've got 10 billion or just 5 billion. They're billionaires. They're not going to stop their normal day-to-day spending habits just because their portfolio went down from 10 billion to 5 billion. It's the people whose money goes down from 50,000 to 25,000 that are stopping those services. Now, in that kind of a probability field, one of the healthiest things, if you don't want to see crime escalate, if you don't want to see violence escalate, if you don't want friendships to rupture, is to pool, is to be aware of the community variable and to pool. Now, in a sociopathic culture, that's not what's done at all. It's about competing. For example, in the United States, in that crisis with my business in landscape design and installation, I did 2 things that saw my business growing. I wrote the only local landscape book about local landscaping and self-published it. And I started teaching at a college using the book as a curriculum, and my business went up while the entire market went down 50%. This wasn't good for the industry, it was good for me personally. In a sociopathic culture, it's the individual that's out for themselves, and everyone else is left to that. And if you try and help other people, you learn very quickly that you get taken advantage of because other people are also thinking about themselves and not how they can reciprocate, etc. So it's the most important thing to understand in this whole concept is that every environment creates a probability field. And that probability field will generate a certain percentage of pain and a certain percentage of well-being. And the most important activity for anyone in that group is to decrease the pain of the probability field and increase the well-being as a probability field and move from that point in a positive direction, and to decrease volatility in some ways. The socialist democracies, for example, have a much higher quality of life, but also much happier people. And one of the interesting things to circle back about American friendships is in the framework of a crisis that's going to hit the typical American within a 10-year period. Most American friendships are more shallow, so that the friends around the person going through a crisis can dissociate, cannot have their own standard of living go down to participate in their, quote, friend's crisis. So the relationships are more shallow. Whereas in Denmark, because there is not going to be a crisis, there isn't going to be someone highly in debt, desperate to pay medical bills, that is drinking too much and that needs to talk to someone and that needs to borrow some money and who's not going to pay the money back and this and that. There isn't going to be that person in Denmark. And the resulting impact on relationships is there's deeper level of commitment, deeper level of presence, because their relationship is not going to be tested by a life trauma within a 10-year period. So these are the ways that probability fields play out. And this is where real science can be done. The real science is saying, if we do it this way, what are all the variables that are set in place as a probability in 1,000 people? And if we do it this, what all happens in a group of 1,000 people? And how can we continually redefine the culture to spit out better and better probability fields for all involved? Because when you go from an environment where, let's say, 90% of people are safe and secure and abundant, to where 100% of people are safe, secure, and abundant, as a matter of principle, crime plummets, prisons plummet, trauma plummets, relationships deepen, well-being goes up. You don't have to buy so many car alarms. You don't have to buy so many safe. You don't have to do as much encryption. The whole defense industry collapses when you start making more and more allies as opposed to pissing various factions off around the world. And in that scenario, you then turn that money. For example, the United States spends more on military spending than the next 25 countries combined. You turn that money towards investing in the well-being of its people. And you aim at a probability field, and you can have a healthy competition. If the Danes are currently with a 300% higher quality of life than the typical American, you can turn that towards a healthy competition. Let's see every year if we can do a digital census and make headway on the real metric. The real metric is well-being. The real metric of intelligence is not how many people you can murder or poison or intimidate or whatever it is that we're doing. The real metric is how efficiently can a given individual, a given group, a given country turn energy into abundance, turn energy into well-being, turn energy into sustainable, self-replicating well-being that spreads throughout more and more of its people. That's the metric of intelligence.